ladies and gentlemen, welcome to spooky season here on Midnight at the Spaghetti Factory. My usual co-host is not with us. Mr. Rainwater had a loss in the family this past week, and he and I both determined that it probably was not the right time for him to be talking about death and Halloween and creepy stuff around such a time of loss, I guess, is the best way to describe it. But we are thinking of you, Mr. Rainwater. You are in our thoughts. And, you know, good vibes go out to you and the family. Hopefully, we'll be able to pick back up with you next week. However, we have two special guests this evening, both of them from my world. We are in the filmmaking zone tonight, ladies and gentlemen. So even if you are an artist who is not a filmmaker, hopefully you will still be able to pull something from the discussion tonight. But we have Krista and Michael from the Lost Signal Society, correct? That's the name of the pod.
That is right.
That's correct.
And right before we get into the discussion, where can they find you guys? Do you guys have a central place that you upload to, or are you everywhere?
No, you can find our stuff everywhere. But in addition to the podcasts, starting this October, we're going to start releasing some video shorts. So give us a follow on Twitter at Lost Signal SOC or on Instagram at Lost Signal Society. That's probably the best way to, keep in touch with us and see what we're up to. We have a website too, but that's about it.
Who uses websites anymore?
Go to my blog.
It's all about the social channels, pretty much. Yeah. So you're gonna be doing like short, like horror videos and stuff, or are you talking about like discussions about horror, or are you doing like horror, like entertaining narratives?
Like scripted content, like short films for now, and we have one coming out. I'm almost done it. It'll be out in a couple weeks, just in time for Halloween.
That's awesome. So that's actually what our discussion is primarily about this evening. We're going to be talking about executing horror, making things scary. Like, I know there are plenty of podcasts out there that are discussing, characters and story and all that kind of stuff. And it's been done to death, no pun intended. I'm more curious to discuss the ideas that go into executing horror in filmmaking, because there's maybe we're peeling back the curtain a little bit here, but there is a tried and true method. There is experimental type stuff that people do. There's all kinds of subtle things that people don't know about that filmmakers do that heighten sensitivity and put you on the edge of your seat and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to kind of get into it today with other filmmakers, because we are the ones that execute the idea of horror. So I'm curious to know from either of you, can lead this off with your answer. What to you is your favorite way to execute a scare? What's like, when you think of a script or something that you're going to do as a film, what kind of a scare get you excited? Like the day you show up on set, you're like, all right, we're doing that one today, and I'm all about it. Like what jumps out at you? No pun intended yet again. Oh, I'm full of the puns tonight. Not intentionally.
That's a really good question. I haven't really given a lot of thought to that, like the best way to execute a scare. For me, the stuff that kind of, everyone sort of loves to hate on jump scares and stuff like that, and because they're sort of a fleeting scare. It happens and then it's gone and it doesn't really linger. And I somewhat agree with that, but at the same time, I think jump scares have a good purpose, and in horror films they serve their role well. They put us on edge. I really like I wouldn't know the best way to describe it, but just a fleeting glimpse of something, somebody walking past a window, somebody at a bus stop, somebody, that you just kind of like, Michael Myers at Halloween staring at him, in broad daylight from behind a bush, the kind of thing that kind of like kind of unnerves you a little bit. It's like something that you see and you just feel a little uncomfortable about it.
How about you, Krista?
I mean, I love anything that increases atmospheric tension. So I think a lot of times, like, even just like the way something is shot and the way the characters are framed, like, can create this sort of anxiety. I'm a big fan of sort of like the almost like the visual mentalist tricks that cinematographers use to evoke certain feelings. Um, so like, I don't know, I always kind of appreciate that, like putting a character, making the shot a little off kilter, putting a character in a slightly weird part of the frame that's gonna like make things uncomfortable, and like that sort of discomfort can build and lead up to something like a jump scare, and really that 1-2 punch is kind of like a nice, although, on the other hand, like I also love what Michael's talking about too, just like getting a glimpse of something, like a fleeting something. I think sometimes you need all those subtleties to build up to the big thing. And if you don't have those subtleties and all of a sudden something just pops out like a jack in a box, it feels cheap. You know what I mean? You didn't earn that moment.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is 100% spot on. I think jump scares are valid. I think that, I mean, in theory, every scare is almost a jump scare, right? I mean, there's no really way around it. The real thing is when it's the cat that jumps out and runs away, and it's like, oh, that's not moving the story forward in any way. That's not leading, like, giving me a glimpse into the monster here. It's just something startling that happened. And you know what I mean? Like, that's not
Yeah.
something that I really grow on. But like what you guys were both saying, I would kind of combo that to what I would say is what excites me. I'm a big fan of a like wide shot with something in the distance. I like being able to see it but not see it. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
everybody talks about the unknown being scary, and I challenge people sometimes, and I say, well, what do you mean by the unknown? Like, you can't just have a shot of a dark, like a completely black shot, and it's scary because there's nothing really there. Like, that's not going to add anything. But if I can just faintly see somebody staring in the distance, like Michael Myers standing behind a shrub 50 feet away as opposed to 12 feet away, there's something unnerving about that. But then there's also like the execution of the camera, like you guys were talking about, like you're pushing towards that bush. You know what I mean? Like, you're trucking towards it. And then all of a sudden it's like, as an audience member, you're being dragged towards that bush and there's no avoiding it. And it's the same thing. One of my favorite shots in the original 1978 Halloween comes in the third act when Laurie Strode is she's just had a bump into Michael Myers, and she's run across the street and she's banging on the door trying to get the kids to wake up and come downstairs and let her in. And there's a shot that's just locked down right from her perspective of Michael walking out of the house across the street and walking towards her, and it keeps cutting to it of him walking, but it doesn't move, and it makes you feel like you are stuck there, can't move, like in shock as
Mhm.
Michael Myers is coming at you. And that just drives me nuts every time I watch it. That kind of cinematography I love. I think
Yeah.
so Chris, you were talking about
And
the cinematography being the big thing. I'm curious to know if either of you have any kind of, and this ties into the jump scare thing too, when it comes to the editing factor, because editing ends up playing a big part of whether or not, like how long you hold on that shot, how, what you cut to, all that kind of stuff. Is there any kind of editing tricks that jump out at you in terms of executing horror?
I think a really great editor is akin to a really great composer.
Mhm.
Like when you are shooting on a set, you're getting all of these different pieces and these moments and these feelings and these sort of the tones and textures of it. And a really great editor can see what the narrative in the moment needs, and put it together in a way that builds tension, or, hey, we're going to hold on this, we're going to have this be a little bit shorter. And I think that there really is sort of a musicality to that, and to using those things the right way. But
Y-
I mean, I think it's choosing the right things at the right moment. You know what I mean? If you're having a moment where there's a lot of fear, and you want to create a lot of empathy for a character coming in for a close up, like actually seeing someone's face that close up creates a feeling of emotional connection to them. So like knowing when to use those shots, knowing when to pick and choose, I think that's like, that's a huge part of how everything comes together. And editors are sort of the unsung heroes of filmmaking, I think, a lot. You know what I mean? Like, I always say this, I feel like I'm always saying, like, there's this idea that the director is the be all and end all, and really filmmaking is a collaborative process on so many levels, and that's one part that sort of gets, I feel like now more people are recognizing, but Definitely when they should be though, because it's a huge part of it.
Yeah, and if I can piggyback on that, I'm in the process of editing our short right now, and I'm scoring it as well. And to sort of add on to that, the composing factor of it, I'm realizing as I'm, I had the cut, I had everything edited, and I was ready to go and score it, and then I'm realizing, these shots, I linger on that too long, and it's not really matching up well with the score that I'm establishing. So I got to go back and shorten that shot, so it kind of hits the beats of the, the tempo that I set in the score. And then you realize that it's kind of composing the sound and lining up the shots with the sound is creating some sort of, I don't want to say symphony because it's not at all what I'm doing, but you are making some sort of composition in a way, a musical composition. And I'm in the weeds with that right now as I'm doing the score on this.
It's a collage of filmmaking aspects. No, it's absolutely, it's a jumbo, it's a stew, it's a mixed salad, whatever you want to call it. It's 100% that. I know the score, I think, is absolutely one of the biggest keys that's overlooked in horror most often these days. John Carpenter talks about he had a finished cut of Halloween, the original Halloween, and showed it to a studio exec, but it didn't have the score. And he showed it to her, and she said, "There's nothing scary about this. I don't understand what this I don't want this." And then he went and scored it, and then a couple of months, I guess he had it distributed and this and that, and then that exec called him back and said, "This movie is completely different now. This is scary now." And
yeah, I mean, I was telling Krista 2 days ago, I finally finished the first draft of the score a couple of days ago, and I was like, I gotta be honest, when I was like watching the cut of this with no score, I was like sweating, and I was just like, this is not good. I'm dreading putting this out. I wasn't trusting that when I got to the score and it was going to kind of come together, and I wasn't trusting that the way it was playing out in my head would work with the score. But it really did. It's making it, it's making it come together in a way that that I'm proud of and that I like. And it is sort of the unsung hero of many horror films.
It's not unsung to me. I like straight up, I love horror soundtracks so much that I like listen to them very much recreationally, like as music as well, to the point where like on the Halloween soundtrack is kind of on my running playlist year round, which really is very motivating.
I can understand that. I'm torn with what kind of music to use when I'm putting together something horrific, because you look at something like the original Halloween, you look at something like Friday the 13th, they have like, I don't want to call it catchy scores. Like, you can ask someone to hum you the Halloween theme and they'll do all that kind of stuff. They'll, same thing with Friday the 13th, kill, right? They have that kind of thing. But then you also look at something like The Conjuring that came out recently, and it's just like a horn blaring most of the time. It's very, I want to call it atmospheric, right? Like it's just a soundscape almost of things being used as like an undertone. And I think that's another technique that if you're doing a horror film, you need to be aware of, is that sometimes even when like people are like leading up to a jump scare, they will insert frequencies into the soundtrack. And when I say the soundtrack, I don't mean the musical score. I mean like the underlying audio underneath everything at a certain frequency that it's almost like a dog whistle. And
infrasound. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it just completely puts you on edge, and you have no idea that it's happening. And then when that, it hits that score and that jump scare or whatever executes, that's when you go like 0 to 60 with your heart rate. And I don't know how I feel about that, because not trying to get into the weeds like how a lot of other shows and podcasts do about story and character and this and that, but I feel like those manipulations might be a little bit cheaper, but no one gets to call them out on it because most of the time you don't realize it's happening. So is that, in your guys' opinions, is that fair to use that magician trick of that dog whistle to heighten the scare?
I think totally. I mean, that's a tool of filmmaking. I think that's, they're just playing, using the tools that they have at their disposal to heighten tension and execute some level of suspense. I think it's, anything's fair game.
I also think as like at the core, like all of the decisions that you're making need to serve the story that you're telling. And so if you're just using the infrasound, if you're just using an atmospheric soundtrack because someone else did it or whatever, then no, that's not the right decision. Or like maybe something does need a little bit more of a, like you said, like something with a catch that's going to call back, something people can recognize and will recall when they hear that line of music again. It calls to mind something that happened previously in the film. As long as your choices are serving the piece as opposed to your idea of what it should be, I think that it's the right decision. That's a terrible answer.
The ends justify the means.
Yeah. Well, and to go back kind of to what you were saying about a good memorable score, I think a good horror score, as opposed to, an epic drama or an adventure film is an exercise in restraint and minimalism, because you don't want the score to sort of overshadow everything else,
I don't know. What
Chris
about like
disagrees.
Exorcist and Suspiria? I mean, those have
the Exorcist score is pretty minimalist when you actually listen to it. There's not it's repetitive. It's sort of a looping arpeggio. It's there's not a whole lot going. I mean, there is a lot going on. It's a masterfully crafted score, but it's it's not John Williams. It's not a full orchestra.
I want John. Has John Williams ever done a horror score? I'm like, I have a notepad.
Jaws Jaws.
Yeah,
is,
Jaws counts.
But when he, that's interesting, Michael. That does sort of play to your point, right? John Williams does horror. John Williams does Jaws. What do we get? We get a very minimalist line. I'm not convinced. I think that sometimes like opulence is necessary.
I mean, Malignant gets a pretty involved score at some parts. I don't know.
But is that scary? Because at some points in that movie, it's just over the top ridiculous. So I mean, is the score reflecting that?
They use "Where Is My Mind," I think, as sort of a orchestral version of "Where Is My Mind," and it's very overblown.
Well, what about Phantom of the Opera?
Oh
God, don't get me started on that.
That does bring up, the older horror films, the Universal ones. They had sort of string and orchestral scores, and those were
or nothing at all, which I pointed out the other day during my very first hosting show that I did with Haunted Home Theater. I was talking about how the Dracula doesn't have a score at all, and I'm absolutely here for it because the idea of just letting the shots sit there and no score, after a while, like once you lower your expectation that, it's a movie, it's supposed to have a score. Once you get over that hump, you start really just kind of, you let go of that expectation and you kind of just settle with, okay, this is what I'm getting. This is what they're doing. And it works in terms of setting up that atmosphere. It's all visually established atmosphere. There's no audio, like, you know what I mean? Like there's no undertones, there's no frequencies, there's no score, there's no soundscape. Nothing. It's just, hey, here's the sound of a buggy going over the mountains of Carpathia with, the fog moving, and here's a wolf in the background. Like that's the quote unquote score.
Right.
That to me is beautiful
and difficult to execute. I gotta
not to get like too processy about it, but I'm a big believer in obstructions when you make a film, like having certain things that you are, and a lot of times, and many times, all those obstructions come from your actual budget. But putting something like that, if you're going to make something, like putting that on yourself, like, hey, I'm not going to use it. I'm only going to use, you call it diegetic sound that's actually happening on the screen. And like, how do you use that to the best way? Like it could be a really interesting experiment in terror, and it could create a better product than, doing it. I don't know. I just think an obstruction can be really helpful.
I mean, I don't know if either of you would consider this a horror film, but it has horror vibes. No Country for Old Men doesn't have any score, and there are some very terrifying moments of that movie. And it's I didn't really even notice it until the film ended, and a sort of subtle score comes in during the credits.
I don't know if I would call it terrifying. It didn't terrify me, but it was absolutely tense. Like that's the word that I would gravitate to when I would be describing it. Same thing goes with now don't get me wrong, there's very obviously a score in The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan. But when he chooses to use it is not as often as you'd expect. There's a good chunk of that movie, for example, the truck chase with Batman on the Batmobile. There is no score.
I know,
going
I
on.
love that.
And to me, like I watched that and I'm like, why the fuck isn't there not like the big operatic superhero chase scene, yada yada yada, and it's not going on. It was it was very clearly a choice that went on. So I like when filmmakers do challenge themselves with things like that. And I feel like in horror, that's one of the things that, you talk about suspension of disbelief when you're creating film, because I think that's the biggest thing you need in a horror film, right? Is that it doesn't matter if there's a style, impressed upon the film, is if that style is set up correctly within the first moments of the film and it adjusts the audience expectations so that they can suspend their belief and they can still be involved in the film, then it's fine to have that style. But I feel like a score is one of those things that no matter how often you set it up or this or that, in the back of someone's mind when they're watching a movie, it's a quick little reminder, hey, you're watching a movie when that music comes in. That's one of the reasons why they didn't have it in the original 1931 Dracula, was that I believe the studio execs were like, if there's not music on screen, no one's going to know, where this music is coming from. Their audience is going to get confused. And while I don't agree with that, obviously, because we have music in movies these days, I think a part of you can ingrained is just like, oh yeah, like back, you're not thinking about it, but it's there. Like it's a safety blanket almost.
Yeah. I remember us watching, maybe it was Rise of Skywalker, and I'm sorry, I'm getting away from horror, but there's sort of a constant score in that movie in every moment, and it doesn't really let the score, it doesn't let you breathe at all. It's sort of constantly telling you, here's your emotion here, here's how you should be feeling here. And I think that speaks to what you were saying, is like, a good score is effective in certain moments, but also steps back and lets you just sort of get into the scene a little bit.
Now I'm curious, Michael, you said you were editing. When you guys went into the editing process, so wait, now let me just ask, Chris, what's your position on this particular film?
The one that we're working on now?
Yeah, like were you writer, director? What were your various positions? Just that, because I want to see what perspectives differ here.
Sure. So I was the cinematographer for this one. And Michael and I are always Michael wrote this and he directed it. And it's called Halloweeny. It's sort of a horror comedy. And yeah, so when we write something, we're always, when one of us writes something, the other one story edits it. So, but this was kind of, so I've been there since the beginning, but on set I was DP.
Okay. So I'm very curious. When you went in, clearly, since you guys work as a team, and I'm assuming that you do it often, you had a shared vision, right? It was discussed ahead of time what the plan was, right? So you were going to execute. Was it intended on being like you said it's a horror comedy, but is it like a slow burn? Is it a slapstick? Is it what I mean? Like, did you have that kind of shared thing? Because the question I'm leading into is whether Michael, because I've done this because I've been an editor, when you watch something 627 times in the edit bay, the pace changes in your mind on edit number 634 as it was 300 edits ago. You know what I mean? And you start getting impatient and you think, we need to speed this up. And then someone else walks in and goes, no, that's going fine. And you're like, no. Like, it's almost like this weird, not impatience. I don't know what the word is that I want to use, but it's like you've seen it all before and you want to get there. You want to keep it moving. You don't want to bore someone. So I'm curious to know, when you're doing the score for something like that, how does that get changed after you've edited it? Like, you go in with one particular intention. Does it change by the time you get to the end? Or do you keep the faith and stay to the original plan?
I think one of the good things about being in an artistic partnership, and Michael and I met, God, how many years ago now, Mike? 8?
No. So, I think it was when I moved here, so it would have been 6 years ago.
Okay. We met.
We were in New York.
Yeah, he moved to New York. We were both. I was a producer's assistant. He was a production assistant for the show Mr. Robot, and so we've been working together he showed me a short story. We became friends. I think he wore a Frankenstein T-shirt, and then we were like, oh. also here now.
Friend.
Uh, like literally. So when you've been working with somebody for that long, you know that those moments are coming. So like you can, like, when Michael was like, ugh, like I don't know how this is going, like, who's getting anxious before he put the soundtrack in, like I was like, no, this is still looking good. This is still, when you're with like somebody like working that way, part of your job as a artistic partner is to like support their vision and also like help them carry it through. And when they have the moment of lose the faith, like you sort of bolster them. And also when there are things that aren't working, you're honest with them. And so we have that back and forth between each other. So I think that that's really helpful. It can be hard to work in a vacuum. And also like oftentimes when people are joining your project, they might be hesitant to tell you that they feel something is off because they want to support your vision. But like Michael and I have known each other long enough and worked together long enough at this point where we can sort of recognize when things are going well and when they're going off the rails for the other one. Because we sort of trade back and forth.
It's that established shorthand, like that's the mind meld that kind of happens when you have an established crew, or just a filmmaking relationship. And that's definitely something to be admired and sought after. If anyone out there is listening and you're kind of new to the idea of filmmaking, is the more you work with someone, I mean, obviously, the people will have creative differences. There will be people who go in different directions, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But filmmaking is very much like dating all over again. It's it's an art, because it's really one of the very few artistries that requires collaboration. You know what I mean? Like you could theoretically do a lot of the stuff yourself, or even maybe all of it. Doesn't mean it's going to be good. There's a few exceptions here and there, but for the most part, you need to find the people who seek out the things that are chasing the same ideas that you're after, because not only is it going to make you stay on schedule a lot easier, the end result is going to be a lot closer to what you all were trying to get to. Which I can honestly say, as a filmmaker, when I've worked on sets like that, even if the film itself didn't end up working, it didn't hit with people or whatever, I'm still happy that I worked on it. I'm still proud of the work that we did. It's just like that one, it just didn't hit. Whereas sets that I've been on before where I'm like, they are doing this all wrong. And I'm that guy sitting in the back going, nope, don't do that. This is going to suck. Like, that's the worst thing. That's where I feel like I'm wasting time. So that leads me into another question I have for you guys.
Actually, before you move on, I want to.
Sure.
So I always liken what we do, especially because so Michael and I work on majors projects, but then when we're doing our horror stuff, when we're doing our personal stuff, we're working with a smaller crew. Like I said, Lost Signal Society is kind of a collective, and so we have people who come back again and people who come in and out. But I really always kind of liken it to being in a punk band. That you have a bunch of people coming together. You have like one thing, you're just trying to get it done and get it done in a way that is like carries your message and is collaborative. And so it kind of feels like that. Like it's sort of forming this garage band of people that you can work together with, and like the new faces and old faces depending on the needs of the project. But having that sort of connection with those people, I think is important. And I don't know. I just feel like it's very similar. The end. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. I thought you were just
once gave Michael a birthday card that was basically 2 lines of happy birthday and then a biography of the band Fugazi, because I wanted to make that point that like us making movies was like being in this garage band. So
hey, you know what? It really is though. Like you really it becomes almost a family type of dynamic at some point. I akin it to dating, but it's very much that kind of a thing where, you know, you and especially because you spend so much time with these people. A lot of people equate filmmaking to war. You know what I mean? Like and I'm not gonna lie. When you get out of a shoot, that first day is, you've got like, I call it film wear. When I come home and I go to bed, like after a very long, usually the last day is like a 16-hour day because why not? I will fall asleep and I will wake up at like 11 o'clock the next day and my whole body hurts. Like it's like you've been shot at, you were in the trenches, and those kinds of experiences are impactful on the human psyche. So like if you're going to be there with people who you disagree with, don't like, think are fools and idiots, like, it's not worth it in the end. It really isn't. I mean, unless you're really strangling for pay. And let's be honest, in indie film, there's not a whole lot of pay. There's the copy credit and pizza for lunch every day. Like, that's basically what you end up getting. But what I wanted to get at with you guys was, in terms of horror filmmaking, at the very least, have there been any mistakes you feel like you've made that you've learned from and were like, I'm not doing that again? Or, you know what I mean? Or just something that you really thought was going to work and it just didn't? Or things that, you know, stick out to you that you loved once before, maybe you don't love them anymore? Anything in that kind of nature that you can pass on to listeners about, you know, that they can maybe not necessarily avoid, but they can kind of examine before they go on set and execute those similar things?
I would say, I mean, for Halloweeny, which I'm putting together now, and this is especially important with horror when, you know, each cut matters so much, and, you know, and the cuts are what's building suspense. I storyboarded every single shot of this movie like it was an animated film. Because when I've done stuff before, you go and you might have a shot list, you have a vague idea of like what you want to get, but, you know, for me to have had that storyboarded on when we were shooting this, we didn't use the script anymore when we were shooting. I mean, there's very little dialogue, but, you know, it just got to a point where I was just pointing at a shot on the storyboard thing and saying, okay, this is what we're setting up now. And just to go back to what we were talking about a little bit ago about, you know, how it was coming together. I don't think had I not done that, it wouldn't be edited together the way it's working like I wanted it to. And I think it's because of that, you know, preparation beforehand. That would probably be the, you know, advice.
So preparation is the key, basically.
Preparation, you know, and it doesn't have to be elaborate storyboards, but I just think, you know, sort of an idea in your mind of, you know, how this is going to cut together.
Yeah, you do not have to be, because like Michael is an excellent artist. I am not very good at drawing, so like Michael's storyboards are always very like nicely done, and he'll help me with mine. But like a lot of my storyboards are literally stick figures, but they still are so helpful in terms of going through and having that framed out. So that I would definitely agree with that for sure. I would also say that we were really lucky in that. So we've been working obviously, you know, on larger projects, but when we decided to start working together and you know, before the podcast, we actually were intending to make one of the podcast episodes as a short film. And because that didn't work out, we ended up doing, we figured, well, instead of doing one short film, what if we did at least 6 radio plays? Okay. And it forced me to engage in a part of directing that I think I hadn't had as much experience with, because while the visual aspect and the sound and editing and putting all that stuff together is super important, there's also a like spending time, like either if you can spend time either in theater or you know, in a situation where you get to work with actors and without the pressure of creating a visual element and just talking about their performances and figuring out how to work with them and how to get the best performances out of the people that you're bringing together, like that is incredibly worthwhile. And the first day that you're shooting on set, you don't want to be figuring that stuff out. So if you can do rehearsal, even if you don't have a lot of experience with maybe directing theater or directing people in a different sort of context, like getting people together, doing read-throughs, having that time to establish a relationship, you're going to get a much better performance on screen. That connection that you foster between the actors, really, it's not as much between yourself and the actors, it's having the actors between each other, the better result you're going to get. So we got to sort of do that and make those mistakes, so to speak, with the podcast and then bring that forward. Even though last time Michael was playing one of the parts, but you got a lot of experience by us doing the podcast. I feel like, when we went into that. So it was really helpful.
Where you get to kind of find your footing before you actually start locking stuff down. Oh, I absolutely agree with that. Chris, I'm curious, since you were cinematographer, I've always wanted to ask this. How does a cinematographer feel when the director shows up with storyboards Like, is that to you and and almost like, oh no, we're not doing this. I want this shot. No, that shot's too basic. Like, how do you handle that? You know, how do you still be able to put like your imprint on it?
I mean, listen, I obviously have a very close friendship with Michael, so like I'm not insulted that he's like coming in and stepping on my toes. I'm also not very precious about work in that way. Like
Okay.
I just want the best thing to sort of win. And because he and I can always have a dialogue, like there are shots and Michael will tell you that I was like, wait, I really want to do this. Like, can we do this? And he was very like, we included those, like there was a back and forth and like
Yeah,
a dialogue between us. And because we had that dialogue, it was fine. You know, we trust each other.
I
Sorry.
would say the storyboards were a roadmap, and it's at least it's here's how this is. I want this to play out. But if on the day, if anybody, if Chris or anybody is even say it'd be cool to have this, I'd be game for that. That goes back to what Chris was saying about the collaborative spirit of the kind of work we want to do. Anybody that's on set can come in with an opinion, and nobody's going to be saying, it's not like when we're working on the big studio stuff where you have to stay in your lane. If an actor is like, wouldn't it be cool to do this, or if anybody, a PA is says something, it's all fair game, and it's all welcome to that sort of
yeah, and
input.
I think that's part of the reason why we never refer to Lost Signal Society as a production company. We always say it's a production collective, because when we get a group together to work on a project, it is truly collaborative. Like I'm of the opinion also that if like somebody's contributing something to the script, that they should be credited as a writer. Like if an actor is bringing something to the table that was not in the script before, if they're changing lines, if they're saying, hey, like doesn't this make more sense, like that, things like that, like they need to be sort of recognized and integrated. And like there's this sort of, I think a lot of times ego gets in the way of that, and also money gets in the way of that on a larger set. But when you're working the way that we do, like we are really pushing towards a different kind of set. And not that there's anything wrong with like when you're doing a really, really, really big project, there is something to be said for having that sort of militaristic division of labor within set, and also for union purposes as well. It makes sense. But on a smaller set, like you can do things that are more collaborative, and it's why I kind of like being able to like focus on both a little bit. I get a little bit of both worlds, and I get to sort of pick and choose what works for us and what doesn't.
Can you guys talk about the idea of making a horror comedy? I feel like we're going to have a little bit of not tension between us here, but definitely a conflicting dialogue, because I'm of the mind that there is no such thing as a horror comedy. There's just comedy, and it might be set in like a horrific, type surrounding, but it's just comedy. Like I look at something like Scream, and I can say that that's kind of as close to horror comedy as I'll get, because I feel like the horror stays pure to the horror, the comedy stays pure to the comedy, and they both kind of stay in their lane. Mm-hmm. It's not like so for example, like a James Gunn thing, where James Gunn will have a horrific thing happening, but he'll also infuse that running line of comedy through it that kind of undercuts the horror, in my opinion. So I'm curious to know what to you is a horror comedy, because I most of the time I don't see them ever as horror comedies. I only see a comedy film that's dressed as a horror movie, if that makes any sense.
I sort of feel like horror and comedy are two sides of the same coin in a way, in that what makes something funny is timing. And what makes a good horror movie, what makes a scary scene, comes down to timing. That's the reason I think Jordan Peele could transition out of comedy and do horror. He understands beats. He understands, this goes back to what we said about music. He understands how to execute something with, something well timed. So I sort of think, they kind of tap in, being scared and then laughing at something kind of taps into the same, part of your brain. I remember seeing, was it Paranormal Activity? It was in a packed theater when it came out, and there was a lot of jump scares in that movie, a lot of scary moments, and the theater would erupt, and then immediately start laughing. It was just like this knee-jerk reaction to laugh after that. not totally sure where I'm going with this, but my my point is, I think the reason you get a lot of horror comedy is that, you know, horror fans like the scares, but they also like the laughs. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of times there are silly moments in horror movies that sort of then lend themselves to sort of, you know, a comedic moment, or lend themselves to parody, or lend themselves to, you know, just, you know, comedy in general. I'm not sure if that totally answers, you know, your question, but, you know.
No, I mean it's very clear. You know, comedy has when I watch a movie and someone's like, "Oh, it's a drama," you can watch Shawshank Redemption and there's still jokes in that movie.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's still moments where there's a funny beat here and there. And the same thing with horror movies. Like, I have nothing against like there being a joke or a running gag or something in a horror movie. There's no problem with that. But I feel like when the two things meld into one particular scene, it gets muddy. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't like the idea of being scared and laughing at the same time is conflicting to me, because I would rather just engage in that one emotion and take it to its height versus having them tug of war between what I'm supposed to be doing. I remember seeing, have you either of you seen Hereditary?
Yeah.
Sure.
Spoiler alert. There is a scene in the third act of that film where I don't think it's Toni Collette. I think it's the son is like floating and goes up to the treehouse. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
I was in a packed theater. I saw that movie. I went by myself because no one else would go with me. It was too artsy for my normal horror friend, and it was too horror for my artsy friend. So I went by myself, and it's weird because it was a packed house. And in that moment, it wasn't like you were talking about, Michael, where someone was horrified and then they knee-jerked and then went into laughter. Half of the crowd was laughing at it like it was not, like it was just so ridiculous and absurd that it was hilarious. And the other half of the crowd, literally, and I'm not exaggerating this is not hyperbolic at all, the person to my right was scared shitless. The person to my left was laughing hysterically at the same beat. Like, it was just, it's odd to me how like people's perceptions can do those things, but neither one of them was in the middle. Does that make any sense? Like,
Right,
one
yeah.
of them thought this movie was a complete joke. The other one thought it was a horrific triumph. And I'm just curious, like, when you go into making a horror comedy like you guys did, what was your end goal? Did you want to, if you had to pick one, gun to your head, what do you want your audience to do? Do you want them to laugh or scream in terror?
I don't really
I
think that it works that way.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
You're welcome to disagree.
I mean, I'll say, just as the director of this one, I think laugh is what I was mostly going for. I mean, you'll see it when it comes out. I don't think there's any particularly scary, genuinely scary moments. I think it's, you know, it's all played for laughs. Yeah.
I also think that there's a difference between using horror aesthetic as window dressing and actually integrating the two. You know, you have stuff like Scary Movie, which just uses the imagery of horror to play for laughs, and then you have films like, I'm sorry, like, I really feel like both the Evil Dead films are very like well integrated horror comedies. I think like Dale and Tucker Against Evil, or The Cabin in the Woods, like all of those meld those two genres. And of course, like you said, like if you're trying to have it be in the same moment, like, yeah, it's gonna be cluttered in terms of what you're asking from your audience, but there's a way to balance those two things. You know.
So
that happens in Evil Dead, like there's, or at least Evil Dead 2 more, like, you know, where there's demons talking trash, and it's sort of like in the moment, in the scary moments, they're playing them for laughs.
Yeah, because I remember I hadn't seen any Evil Dead movie at that point, but I went and saw Drag Me to Hell, and I had no idea what I was getting into because I was not. I think at that point the only thing I was familiar that Sam Raimi had done was the Spider-Man movies. And when I went to see that movie, the trailers set my expectations wrong. I was like, "Oh, this is a horror movie, and it looks really good." And when I got to it, it was there was definitely horrific things going on, but it was dialed to 11, where, you know, like people were like doing dancing in the air while someone was getting sucked into a Ouija board or something. And I just remember thinking, "What is this? I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing in this moment."
I'm always just like very cautious of even in my own mind of like deciding what something should be.
Mm.
Like horror should be this way, comedy should be this way, or even beyond that in terms of like artistic projects. It's and like maybe this is a little animist, but like I often feel like the ideas have their if you're really truly serving the idea, that's when you're going to get the best result. And like when you put your expectations on things like that, it can sometimes limit you from making something be as good as it can be.
See, that's part of my problem is expectations. I have set expectations almost all the time.
I want my expectations to be subverted. Like if you're not fucking with my, like I watch a lot of fucking media and sorry, am I allowed to curse?
Yeah. Oh, fuck yeah.
Okay.
No worries.
I watch a lot of media. So like if you're not at this point, like if you're not subverting my expectations a little bit, I'm going to be a little disappointed.
That's fair.
I like subversion.
I think there's also, this is kind of a question for everybody. It brings up, are we watching horror movies only to be scared? Or like, I come at different horror movies with different things in mind. I'm going to put on, let me try to think of one. I don't know.
If I want
Night of the Demons or something,
yeah.
or something like that, and I'm going in because I just want to have fun and watch some cool special practical effects. I wanted to I don't think I'm going to walk out of there scared.
Turn off your brain type of movies. Where,
yeah.
I watch Demoni very differently than I watch Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair.
Or I'll watch House on Haunted Hill from the 50s in a very campy, fun way. But I might put on The Exorcist with the lights out and be ready to get, super scared, even though that has some funny moments.
I think you raised a good point, Michael, because this is one of the things that it was a complaint, and I actually voice it in the screenplay for the horror film that I'm working on. I'm assuming because you guys are horror nerds just like me, you go to haunts this wonderful spooky season. Walk in, into a haunted house or the trails or wherever they may be. I have noticed, and I'm definitely not the first person to notice this, but after the second or third person that pops out at you, you're over it. And it's like, you just keep walking and you're like, all right, when's the next person coming? Hi, how you doing? Nice makeup. Okay. And you keep going and like it's completely ruined. Like, so when you're watching a movie, to Michael's point, when that comedy beat comes in or a drama beat or something that shifts that tone out of horror, that resets the horror gauge. You know what I mean? Like you're reset for the scare. And that's one of the reasons why I'm okay with jokes and personal relationship drama or even melodrama and all that kind of stuff, shoved into a horror movie, because at some point it's tired and it's beaten, because I'm not there for just that one note. I am there for a full experience of emotion. Like I want the spectrum. I'm greedy like that. I want the comedy. I want the drama. I want action. One of the biggest underlooked subgenres of horror is a action horror. And like that's one of the genres I'm dying to see come back. Tales from the Crypt, Demon Knight is one of my absolute favorite horror movies, and I say that as a horror movie because it really isn't a horror movie. It's kind of like when I talk about horror comedies, I say they're just comedies. It's much more of an action movie, but I don't want to say, like how Chris said before, it's not dressed up for action by the horror aesthetics. It's a horror setting and the action is dialed in. Like that's the kind of perspective that they're lending to this particular story. And I like that. I think that's refreshing. That's subverting expectation. If I went into that thinking, all right, this is just a movie about people trapped in a house trying to keep a demon out, like that's just a straight up horror movie, I'm bored by that. But the fact that they have shotguns and there's all this, like Billy Zane is acting kind of campy and all this fun stuff, like it makes it different. And that to me is really what I search for sometimes. But then I feel like sometimes the market gets saturated with the same kind of stuff. It's the complaint that never dies, because that's business. Something is successful, other people just completely imitate it and they rip it off and they drive it into the ground. So I'm curious to know, going back to why you guys decided to make a horror comedy. That genre is quite prevalent in the indie horror film genre these days. So I'm curious to know, what was it about that particular genre that spoke to you guys about wanting to add to it?
I think that's just the script that showed up.
Okay.
I mean, I think anything I write, kind of, even I've tried writing more dramatic stuff. I've tried writing serious stuff. If you listen to our podcast episodes, the 3 episodes of the 6 that I write all inevitably become, comedies. Whether they're funny is, is
That's subjective, sure.
But I all the short stories I write, the ones that have, been responded to, with the most, positive response, tends to be funny. I think I just sort of, that's where I end up going, even if I try to sit down and write. If I were to sit down and try to write something super scary, I think it would just ultimately become a comedy. So it wasn't necessarily a conscious decision. It was, this is the story that came out when I sat down to write it.
We're far better artists than we are marketers, and deciding what is a gap in the market and filling that. And also, I think that he and I have slightly different, if you listen to the episodes that of the podcast that Michael wrote and the ones that I wrote, even though we work with each other at we have very a sort of different take on things. I am a little bit darker, I think. But then on the other hand, I also feel like I can't make something completely 100% straight. There's always a little bit of comedy. There's always a little bit of snark to it, because that stuff is fun. And at the end of the day, that is, I really enjoy having fun.
No,
that's
100% the right answer. And in a weird question situation, it's 100% the right answer to say, that's what I enjoy.
Yeah.
Right? There's no argument to combat that. And as artists, I think that's what we have to do, is what we enjoy. Because if you show up to the work that you dread, the work is going to suffer and it's going to show. And people read that.
And, we are often in the position where we are bringing someone else's creative vision to fruition. And I am very thankful that we've been able to make a career doing that, for sure. And it informs a lot of our work, but then getting into our world and getting free reign and getting to do something a little less serious and getting to have those moments and choosing where those moments happen is just fun. So we like to have fun. What a dumb Tinder profile fucking answer, but yeah.
I don't know that we've said it. I think Kristen, I should say, we both work in film and television production, and this is just for the listeners, as production coordinators. So scripted network television shows and films shot in New York and Brooklyn.
Talk a little bit about that. How has that kind of influenced how you guys approach indie filmmaking? You know what I mean? Because they are two very different beasts. One has money, and the other one does not.
And that's kind of it. It for a while for me. Well, I came from what was essentially indie PBS. I worked at a PBS station in Denver.
I'm sorry, and not to toot Michael's horn, but he'll never bring this up. But Michael has a regional Emmy for his documentary on the Small Dones crime family.
It was not on the Small Dones. It was on a.
Sorry.
Which one was it for? It was on a Japanese internment camp. I think.
Doesn't even remember what his Emmy for.
That's still, man. An Emmy is an Emmy. Let's just let it lie right there.
So I worked at Rocky Mountain PBS in Denver, and that was sort of where I learned filmmaking, because it was, I got to do a little bit of everything: edit, shoot, conduct the interviews, do the research. I was in the library, the local, historical library, pulling out photographs, and I sort of learned how to wear a lot of hats. I come to New York, and this is where I met Krista, and started PAing on, big budget network stuff, studio films, and I kind of it sort of hindered me from making my own stuff for a while, because I saw what goes into making the stuff that, we're used to seeing. And it was sort of, if I want to do something right, I need to have all this stuff. I need to have a department head for every one of these. And it took me a while to overcome that and just say, let's get our cameras, let's DIY this and make stuff. So yeah, it was almost like seeing how it was done when you have a lot of money was stopping me from doing it when I don't have money. I don't know, Chris,
fair.
if you had a similar kind of experience. It's just knowing how it's made with money, and how the stuff that influences us is really made, and not having those resources was making me, afraid to actually go ahead and do it.
Not to cut Chris off, because I do want her to answer this question still, but I've worked on major motion picture sets, and that was a lesson I learned as well, which was they are duct taping the camera to the side of the car as much as an indie film is sometimes, and you know what I mean, just to get some kind of a shot. And it's like, oh, it's whatever works. Like it's whatever it takes to get the shot. And sometimes, I mean, that goes too far. Like I believe her name was Sarah Jones, who passed away. Like when I'm, if I get interviewed to work on a set or something like that, and I'm talking to whoever's, doing the hiring, I always tell them, my standard number one is safety. That's where you have to draw the line in terms of, cutting off creativity and production value and this and that is, the safety of the cast and crew. Then the line below that that's a little bit more blurry is whether or not it's legal what we're doing. If it's a felony, I'm like, no, I'm not going to go there. But if it's some kind of, petty thing or whatever, it's like, oh, maybe. Depends. See how I feel. But no, I've learned that lesson as well, is that it really is sometimes the big money stuff can be intimidating, where it's like, oh, it's over. I don't want to say overproduced, but it's like, you know what I mean? Like or micromanaged, but it feels like there's a lot of moving parts that maybe don't have to be there all the time. Like sometimes they do. If you're doing a very complicated action stunt and blowing up a building and throwing 3 people out of a fake glass window at the same time for one shot, yeah, you need the stunt guys there overseeing it. You need 12 cameras. You need cops on set, and you need, lockdown, all that kind of stuff. But if you just have 2 people sitting in a coffee house talking, you don't need those departments, running for no reason. But Chris, I'm curious to know your answer to the question that I've already forgotten, which was something about filmmaking on the how working as a production coordinator has influenced how you work in independent film.
So I will say this. So I got into this industry literally loading boxes onto trucks.
Okay.
And I worked in pretty much almost every department on my way to becoming a line producer's assistant, and then eventually a production coordinator. And now I'm currently working for a live streaming company. I just started that, which has been sort of something interesting to throw in the mix. But what I will say is that while, yes, like I agree, like there is a certain amount of, you don't need all of that all the time, learning how to use your resources wisely and sparingly. But I also say that so as a production coordinator, you are literally working with everyone from the executive producer to the teamsters to all of the grip and the lighting guys and all of the prop people. And you're helping everybody collaborate in a way that's functional and helping them get what they need. And in doing that, you have to be extremely organized, and you have to have this overhead view of how everything is working. And one of the things that I've been really proud of is that when we go and we have actors or we have people come in to work with us, they're always almost surprised at how organized we are. Like we just had a meeting for a film of mine that I'm directing in November, the short. And we brought on this amazing pair of people to work with us for post and for the shoot. And just going through what we had done already, they were like, oh, it's like, yeah, we have spreadsheets and things to keep everything organized, because the reality is the more we prepare and have structure and know exactly where we need what and when, that helps us reduce our cost and makes it more functional to be as indie filmmakers. And B, it shows the people who are helping us for being paid basically by lunch, and they're giving us their time on the weekend, that we respect their time and their contribution, and that alone can engender I think that we almost because we I don't know. And it's not to say that indie films aren't organized or they aren't, that way.
You can say that because it's true. A lot of that. We won't say that all, but let's be real here. The vast majority of them are done run and gun. It's like, oh, I forgot the cell phone prop today, and that was the only prop that was needed on set. Oh, somebody go to a store and buy a cell phone. Here's $100, and it's
And
just
listen,
like,
that stuff happens on big stuff too. Like as a
Yeah.
production coordinator, like one of the main things that I call it "help I'm on fire" is like someone shows up in your office and they're just like, well, like we don't have this thing, like find it, and we have like 30 minutes to find it somewhere in New York City. Like, and sometimes it's something really important, and sometimes it's dumb, like some actor won't go on unless they get a specific kind of water or whatever, but you're always putting out those fires. And like, but when you're on a big budget thing, they're just like, here's a credit card, fix the problem. And when you're on an indie, you don't have that luxury, you know. So I think
Yeah.
it's allowed us to make a lot of to learn how to be organized in a huge way, and then when we scale down a little bit, we're hyper organized, so we can avoid issues like that. Hopefully. And like things pop up and you figure it out. You know what I mean? It just becomes another obstruction. You work around it. And at the end of the day, like if it's between you making something and not making something, like go make it. And also like maybe on your first couple of films, like you're going to make mistakes and you're going to learn from them. And as long as you're continuing to carry those lessons forward, you're going to become a better filmmaker. It's just like writing. Like I have a lot of people approach me and ask me about writing, and they're always like, well, I wrote the script. I'm like trying to pitch it to networks. And I'm like, oh, how many scripts have you written before that? And it's a lot of times this is the first thing they've written. And I'm like, listen, like I have really bad news for you. Like you're going to write like 30 really shitty scripts. You're going to write like a lot of bad short stories. Like when I first moved to New York and I was looking to get some of my fiction writing published, like as I would get rejection letters, I would nail them to the wall. And like I didn't get accepted until the nail fell off because I had written so much shit and sent so much stuff out, you know? And that's the thing. You got to like you have to nail all of your bad stuff to the wall till the nail falls off. And then you're going to be a much better artist and a much better filmmaker.
and that's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. And
Well, nobody wants something fast, you know?
no, yeah, nobody wants to be hurt or rejected, and you know that kind of that kind of stuff sucks.
Yeah.
But I 100%. I not only is that a good motivating tool, the rejection, but it's also a nice way to humble yourself. I remember when I wrote a script, I did the big claim to fame of I wrote the script in a weekend, which, you know, a lot of people like to kind of tout that they do that like they're fucking rock stars. I have read some scripts like that and they're just horrible. And I thought the shit I wrote was gold. Sent it out to a bunch of screenplay festivals, rejected on every single one. Put it in a shelf or put it in a drawer, walked away from it, couple months, came back and I reread it and I was like, this is shit. And but the bright side was I was able to swallow the pill and go, nope, this shouldn't be like this. I didn't see it in my head like this. Why did I write it like this? Like it was one of those first draft things where you're just puking out the idea and you're not really refining it. And that's where I kind of learned that like the rewriting was the real writing to me. And the more I rewrote it, it got the better it got. And then finally I sent it out to the same exact screenplay festivals, grand prize winner, first place winner, official selection. Like those things started rolling in, and it was a very hard lesson to learn that that writing isn't like just a talent you wake up with. It really is a craft you have to refine and learn and work at. And I think that applies to everything in film. So I think the biggest thing that you both were talking about a little bit was the organizational thing about it. I've been on indie sets where they were completely unorganized, run and gun, wing ding, didn't talk to someone, didn't do this, just completely flying by the seat of their pants. And as someone volunteering their time, the thing that pisses me off the most was when they say, oh, we're only going to be doing 4 hours today. And I'm like, oh, okay, I get to go pick up my son and do this, and I'll be able to cook dinner tonight. 16 hours later, they're still trying to figure out how to get the third shot of the day. And it's like, you have no respect for me as a person and a life outside of this. I love this to death. I would die on set if it were up to me. But you have to show that respect. And I think, you know, pizza gets old fast. Everybody's had pizza on film set most of the times a day. Credit is only great when the thing blows up, and otherwise it's just like another thing on your list of IMDb. But the thing that really will get me coming back to help out a filmmaker the next day or the next weekend, whatever it may be, is if they were respectful of my time and my efforts. Because it's like, if I'm not contributing anything by sitting on an Apple box for 3 hours, I don't want to be here. I want to be somewhere where I'm being productive. That's why they call it production. So I think organizing is probably one of the greatest things that I think anyone can take away. And that's not just indie horror. That's anything in filmmaking. If you are acknowledging your cast and crew's time and sacrifice, especially if you're not paying them and pizza doesn't count, yeah, you're setting yourself up for trouble.
Can I actually piggyback on that?
Sure.
Just because it relates to something really important that's happening right now in the film and television industry. There is currently a vote. Now, what you're talking about obviously happens on indie sets, but it happens at an institutional level on these large sets as well, where you have people who are working sometimes repetitive 16, 18-hour days, and they aren't getting reasonable rest. People are falling asleep on the way home and they're dying. So basically the biggest film union, which is basically a union that is made up of a lot of locals, which is like a local is a group of a very specific craft. So a local will contain production coordinators. Another local will contain the set dressers. So all of these groups are getting together as one union, IATSE, IATSE.
Which is the International Association of Theater and Stage Entertainers?
International Alliance. Yeah.
Something. Okay.
The International Alliance of Stage and Theatrical Employees.
That's it. Yeah.
And that's the union that Michael and I are in. So right now there's a vote going on for a strike authorization because we're at a point where we have a negotiation with New Media where they pay us less to make a show for Amazon or for Apple than they would have to if we made one for Fox or NBC or Paramount. And the argument was that in the beginning that nobody really knew if streaming would take off, but now it's the main way that people consume content. And so we want to be paid equitably and paid a living wage. People need reasonable rest turnaround. It's unforgivable that people are dying because they're not getting enough sleep working on film sets. It's just inexcusable. And there's like other reasonable things that we are asking for as well. So if you're a fan of films and you're a fan of television and the work that we do, putting your support, I know this sounds weird, on social media is extremely helpful for us right now, because one of the issues is that the large corporations that the unions are negotiating with own the news companies as well. So a lot of the coverage, if we've gotten it all, has been quite skewed, and like it's important for us to actually get the voices of the craftspeople out there, because obviously making movies is what we love to do, but we want to do it safely and we want to be able to spend time with our families as well.
Not to add on to that, because I'm not part of that particular union, but you just get a better product when you rest your cast and crew appropriately.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's one thing for a person to feel good, but you work not only better, but more efficiently. And I think that's the key word that I think a lot of the money people need to hear, is that if you really want to save money and make money off a quality project or a quality product, the product needs to be injected with quality ability. And that can only be done when a human is rested appropriately and has a quality of life outside. You know what I mean? Because yes, we all love being on set and making movies and this and that. It's not as glamorous as everyone outside of it thinks it is. But we still love it. And just as much as anyone who loves, if you love cooking food, I love cooking food. I love cooking, at home. If I go to work and I'm cooking, when I come home, I want to be able to enjoy time with my son. I want to be able to watch a movie. I want to be able to go swimming. I want to, you know what I mean? Like, I want to live life outside of it, because creativity, you only have so much creativity juice in your body per day. Like, we've talked about this on the podcast in the past, where if you notice, like, certain directors like Christopher Nolan or other directors, they will wear literally the same exact clothes every single day, only because it's one less decision they have to make that doesn't sap their creative juices. So if you're sucking sleep from someone by running them into the ground with a 23-hour day, and they have to wake up and make a decision about, you know, what they're going to do on set that day or how they're going to do a particular assignment or whatever. And they're just trying to think about, how am I going to get a new job when I don't even, like, what time is it? Like, there's no way you're going to get a quality product in the end. So I don't see how people could not understand the cause that you guys are, you know, raising at the very moment. Exactly. But they're looking at
She's
immediate
making the
money.
money sign. Just so
Yeah,
for listeners.
Chris is making the money sign, but they're looking at immediate money versus long-term money. And I'm sorry, I'm a person who likes the long-term money. I would rather get the residuals from a great fucking movie that's on replay every fucking Halloween season, you know, on ABC Family or some shit, than, you know, the quick cash grab or whatever. But that's the downside of Hollywood. So I'm very much behind you guys, and I hope our audience will be too. But, you know, don't always take our word for it. Just if you know someone in film and television, ask them about it. They'll tell you. You know, look it up online. It's not, you know, a couple of bozos on a podcast talking. This is like a reality here. And I promise, if you have money, friends, in this, you need to have a little bit of humanity in your heart, and you need to kind of level with them. And I understand that times are tough, especially right now with pandemic and all that kind of stuff, you know, influencing how productions are handled, and it's additional costs with tests and, you know, social distancing and, you know, all that stuff, you know, has an impact. It does. It absolutely does. But 9 times out of 10, Mr. Moneyman, you're making off like a bandit no matter what. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you got to eat a little right now to be a human for the other people who are making that money for you. It's only fair. But I think I don't think that's why people are tuned into the podcast. So let's wrap up. We've raised that point, but let's wrap up a little bit on horror. I'm just curious to know from you guys, in terms of an execution perspective, what's your favorite moment in any horror movie or TV show? I'll even extend it there. You can go like a top 3 if you have to, if you can't pick one. But I'm curious. I know I'm springing this.
Do you
on
mean
you,
like in a general sense, like or a specific moment from a specific film?
Well, I know, you know, like Chris was talking about something that subverts her expectations. I'm curious to know, like, there's got to be a moment in horror that stuck out to you that was like, that made you a horror fan. Like, there's that meme going around right now on Twitter. It's like, oh, the movie that made me the horror fan. I'm curious to know the moment you became a horror fan. Like, you watched a movie and you were like, wow, I want to do stuff like this. Not necessarily meaning I'm gonna rip this off, but like, this is fun. I want to do this to other people. I want to give this back. I'm curious to know if there's any moments that stand out to you from movies that you've seen that you can recommend to our listeners, because, you know, outside of Halloween and The Exorcist, I'm sure that they might be looking for some movies to check out this season.
Michael, you want to go, or should I go first?
Ahead. I'm gonna think about it a bit.
So immediately 2 things come to mind. One is the hanging death in Dario Argento's Suspiria. I probably saw that movie when I was in later high school. It showed me that the deaths could be beautiful and artistic in a way that I hadn't quite seen before. And that shift in color palette also was like very influential on me. And then from a younger age, when I was, you know, in middle school and riding my bike to West Coast Video to go through their horror section. And I know this is going to sound super pretentious and weird, but I was like a super pretentious and weird, annoying kid. But I was super into Werner Herzog's Nosferatu. And there is a dinner scene where they're having dinner and there's all the rats scurrying around their feet. And like, just the way that movie unfolded, the lyricalness of it, and the strange imagery, like, I became obsessed with it, and I think I rented it like 50 to 60 times. Like, it would be like I would get something else and Werner Herzog's Nosferatu. I probably should have just bought the tape, but I don't think that my parents would like let me buy it. But some reason, like the like older teens at the video store would like kind of like, yeah, here you go, take it.
You got it, yeah.
So those 2 films I think are big. I mean, there's so many other moments as well, but those 2 are like kind of seminal
formative
ones.
Sure.
Yeah, formative for sure. Yeah,
That's
the formative is better than seminal.
I would say early experience is watching Halloween, and we would watch it. You know, I used to trick or treat with the neighbors that lived across the street, and when we would come back from trick-or-treating, we would all empty out our candy, and Halloween would always be on TV when I was growing up. I mean, it still is always growing on TV during the Halloween season. But the street in Haddonfield looked so much like the street where I lived. This is a suburb of Philadelphia. And it just, aside from being a great horror movie, that movie just like feels like fall. Even though it was shot in California, it does do a good job of like, a Midwest or Northeast fall. And I just remember watching it and thinking like, this is just like such a good feeling. Even though it's a movie about a murderer, it's like, here I am going through candy. I was just outside doing this trick-or-treat, and now I'm watching on this movie. And it's just, it's that sensation of fall and autumn and Halloween. And then I think another one, it's weird. It's a trailer that did it, but I was, getting really into film, and I remember watching, it was like an Alfred Hitchcock movie. I think it might have been Psycho. I was just really getting into horror movies, and on the VHS there was a trailer for the Universal monster movies that they were re-releasing the major 8 ones. Dracula, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Invisible Man, the Claude Rains, Phantom of the Opera, Creature from the Black Lagoon, and Mummy.
Wolfman. Don't forget the Wolfman. Come on now.
One. And then that just the trailer, the way it was cut together, I was just like, all these images, these castles, this fog, these sort of bare trees. This is sort of like, this is all the images that are associated with Halloween, and like it's these movies. That's where it comes from. So then I instantly became obsessed with those, and it was like for a while the only thing I would watch was like horror movies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that's sort of what like made me sort of the lifelong monster kid that I still
Michael,
am.
I might have to have you back on because I really want to talk about Universal monsters with people.
Oh yeah.
I'm a late bloomer and monster kid in that sense, where I was one of those, and Chris, you used the word pretentious before. I don't know if this would be, shallow, I guess is the word I would use for myself, where up until only a few years ago, I didn't want to watch movies that were in black and white. I was just like, yeah. So is shallow the right word then? Because I
love those movies so much. I grew up, like my grandfather really was a big influence on my film stuff. So I also grew up watching those black and white ones, and I had a crush on the Creature from the Black Lagoon. So I don't know how.
What ended up, it was like I had a group of friends, and this is sort of like, we had a West Coast video in my town, and we all, we called ourselves the Horror Movie Club. It's just, pretty nerdy. No girls were there, obviously.
They weren't allowed. No girls were allowed.
No,
that's why, right, Michael?
We would have loved if a girl would have come by. We would go to Blockbuster and West Coast Video and spend an hour picking things out. And we would go back to my friend's house and go to this den where there's a TV and order pizza and watch, every Friday the 13th movie. We'd watch every Freddy movie, prom night. And then it was, that's how I started watching Psycho. And then I started going back in time. And then I started to get into these Universal ones. And that's when my friends were like, we like
drew a line.
Like, this is like, this isn't really what we're talking about. Because those movies, by today's standards, aren't very frightening. But what I liked about them was the atmosphere. I liked the imagery. I like that kind of stuff, castles and fog and things like that. And that's sort of.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to get into after you guys were talking about like the moments with it. For me, I've noticed that atmosphere is the thing that hooks me when it comes to a horror movie. And it might have been because the formative one for me was Tobe Hooper's Salem's Lot, which is, I know it's not a movie, is the miniseries. The kid at the window, scratching at the window with the fog behind him. That was one of the things that I was a kid, and I remember I went to bed, and it was one of those things where I got up as a kid in the middle of the night, and my dad was watching it in the living room, and I walked out to say, oh, I just got to go to the bathroom. And I looked at the TV and saw that and was freaked the fuck out. Like that was like, that scarred me. And then I remember talking about it the next day. My mom was like, oh yeah, I don't watch that movie. I can't be in the same room when that movie's on. So immediately me was like, I have to watch this. I got to know what happens because of this. And I remember seeing the master when he crashes into the kitchen, and he I don't want to call it doesn't form, but he like lumps, and then he lumps again, and you realize he's like fucking tall. And I remember just looking at it and going, this is amazing. I need more of this. And that's when I went forward. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just needed my moment to be somewhat pretentious. I won't watch that movie because that's my favorite book, one of my favorite books.
Oh,
Stephen King. And I read that every October. I'm going to start reading it in a couple of weeks. And I love it so much, and I don't want how I see it in my head spoiled. Even though I hear that movie is great, and I've seen that image of the Glick kid in the window, and it looks so, it's perfect. It's what you're talking about. It's atmosphere. But I'm just like, I don't want to. I love it how it is in my head, and I know that's, I'm not like that with any other book. I'll watch any adaptation, but for some reason that one
But you also mentioned how Halloween feels like fall, and that's something that I think I pitched to you guys when we were talking about doing this. Something that I think is very important, and I know not every horror movie is set in October, but the idea that color grading, like in post or even just on set, putting gels on lights and stuff, giving that warmer tone is something that doesn't happen that often these days. There's a lot of greenish blues that are really kind of hammered these days with the color grading. For some reason, it doesn't work for me, and I don't know what it is, but there's something innate for me when I'm watching a horror movie that I need those warm tones to get me in the mood. Now, don't get me wrong. I can watch John Carpenter's Fog, which color grading wasn't really that big of a deal back then. But it's definitely on the cooler side of the spectrum, and that movie still fucking plays for me. Like it works, but I need that kind of a grade, and that to me. You talked about going backwards. I was getting tired of watching all the horror movies in modern day with the blue tint, and I went back into the wonderful 80s and 70s, and I was watching a lot of stuff there. And then I got old. That got old quick, where it's like, okay, I've seen Halloween a bajillion times. What else is there? And that's when I went backwards and started saying, all right, I'll watch Dracula. I'll watch Frankenstein. And I'm almost glad that I did it, because as an older person, I was able to watch it through in a more mature mindset, where I could appreciate what was going on, and I was more susceptible and open to accepting the idea of just black and white, the fog, the sound, the lockdown shot, like that kind of stuff played better for me as an adult. So I was very late bloomer to the monster party, but I'm here nonetheless. Don't get me wrong. I read Dracula. They had done. It was not the novel. Don't get me wrong, because the novel is basically just journal entry and letter and all that kind of stuff. They had done like a novelization of the movie as a kid, and when they had those like book fairs and stuff like that, that's what I went to, because I was a big Goosebumps kid. Like that, so when I saw Dracula, I was like, oh, I've heard of Dracula, I'll read this, and I was into that, but I had never seen the movie, so that's what really kind of kicked that off. I don't know why I'm getting into this now, but the point of the matter is this: I'm curious to know really quick, as we're wrapping up, your guys' point of view on like the color tone or grading or gels or stuff like that, and how it affects horror movie. Are you doing it on your horror movie now? And then after you've answered that, both of you, let us know where we can find this, the horror comedy, Halloweeny, correct? Mm-hmm. So whichever part you want to lead with, go for it.
Well, let me see what I want to go with. Well, in terms of grading, I think this goes way back to earlier in our discussion about opportunities to sort of subvert expectations. And the reason I'm thinking about this is because a couple nights ago, to kick off October, I watched Children of the Corn, the original one. And something I never realized about that movie is that it's, for the most part, up until the final act, it's all set during the daytime. And it's set in the middle. It's in Nebraska. It doesn't have the sort of typical imagery we associate with horror movies. You'd like a Midwest or a New England sort of setting. There isn't sort of that orange or warm palette. It's just bright daylight and cornfield. And that's I think that's why a lot of people were sort of unsettled by Midsommar too, because that most of that movie was set during the daytime, and it didn't look like a real what you're used to seeing in a horror movie. So yeah, I think that like with color grading, there's opportunities to sort of embrace what's been done with horror movies, but then also sort of subvert expectations by doing something totally unexpected and sort of putting us in a new environment. And then with the one I'm doing, actually, Chris, you can speak to it as the DP about Halloween.
Yeah, how did you want it to look when you were, when you were choosing a color palette, I guess you could say?
So in terms of color grading in horror films as a whole, I think there's two sort of things that are working in conjunction with that. You have just like obviously different different time periods have sort of different styles associated with them. And as people get bored of one sort of aesthetic, they move into another, they get bored of that aesthetic. And I think one of the really interesting things about being a filmmaker right now is that because it sort of has gone the gamut from Dracula to like, to Suspiria to now like movies like Midsommar that are really bright, or Mandy, which is this color soaked psychedelic. You have all of those. No one is going to be taken aback or surprised by any of those color palettes. So you can make that choice based on the needs of the piece that you're making. So that's a really cool opportunity that kind of exists more for filmmakers right now than in the past. In Halloweeny specifically, we had specific challenges where a large portion of the film takes place in a house at night. And so what we sort of decided there is while the framing and the movement and a lot of the things is essentially an homage to John Carpenter, we sort of used that opportunity to sort of move out of that typical color palette and more into things that were a little more color soaked and a little more psychedelic. Also, you can create implications about the mental status or the feelings of your characters through how you're lighting and the color choices that you're making. So if you do choose a more psychedelic color palette, it can imply that certain actions are occurring within the mind of the protagonist as opposed to in the actual, real universe that they're existing. So you can even shift from scene to scene how you're using that light to indicate the mental and emotional state of the people that you're featuring, which we did in Halloweeny, and we're able to sort of push things in certain directions.
That's awesome.
Depending on the shot and depending on what was actually going on.
So you used it as like a I don't want to call it a transition, but it was a way or almost like a compass, I guess, for the emotional response of your audience then, right? Would that be a fair way to describe the intent?
Yeah, totally. I mean, listen, I think the reality is that when you're a filmmaker, what you're kind of doing is you're God, again, sorry, but like,
no, we get into the weeds on this podcast. Like that's the whole point of it. Like that, I like getting into the philosophy and the nuts and bolts and stuff. That's what's interesting to me.
There's this thing where you're kind of contributing layers of meaning, and you have one layer where it's the script, right? And then you have another layer, which is how the actor performs the script. Okay, then where they're performing the script, the setting and the production design. Okay, and then how are we going to shoot that? And then how are those characters moving through the scene? And then how is that scene lit? And then how is the camera then moving to record what's going on in the scene? And each of those different layers is contributing a different layer of meaning. And it's all of those things together which allow film to communicate emotions and ideas and concepts and bring your viewer along with you in such a way, because you are sort of putting them into like a sensory sea of images and aspects of that image that have meaning. And like it's kind of, sometimes when I think about it, it gets kind of shower thoughty, and like I'm just like, how do people even understand what's going on a film? Because like, I'm also a photographer, and like you're taking a single frame and how everybody, and like you see all of the meaning that comes from that single frame, and then you're just by running all of those frames together, you're adding all of these other additional layers. It like almost seems like a minor miracle that it like filmmaking even functions.
Yeah, like it makes sense.
Yeah.
No, I 100% agree and understand exactly what you're saying. It is a miracle that we as humans are able to put that stuff together as an audience. Not even just as as filmmakers, yeah, it's a lot of understanding what the fuck you're doing without being right there as it's being assembled. But as an audience, you know what I mean? Like that. And I think that's when movies fail. Like it's obvious that a lot of things are subjective when you're watching a piece of art. But I think that's 9 times out of 10 when a movie fails, quote unquote. When I say fail, I mean like doesn't connect with the audience isn't responsive. It's because they don't understand what's going on, and someone wasn't in tune with that human primal understanding of how to communicate with people. You know what I mean? So like you talking about, me describing it, but you talking about the compass of the color tone kind of guiding people into and out of an understanding or an emotional journey or whatever. that's the forethought that a filmmaker needs to have. You talked earlier about preparation. Like, that's preparation. If you just show up on set and go, I'm going to throw a purple gel on the key today, and it's like, no, wait, we haven't done this the rest of the movie. Why is that happening? I mean, don't get me wrong. In the spot in the moment, it might be a shot of lightning brilliance, but 9 times out of 10, everyone else is going to be like, why are we doing this in purple today? Like, it's just, it doesn't make any sense. Then that communicates to your audience, and your audience is 3 scenes behind you now going, why was that purple? Does anybody figure that out? Like, and you lose them in the track of the narrative. You lose them in the emotional direction. Like, everything gets lost. So it is definitely got to be the intent of an artist speaking in almost everything that we do. But I'm so thankful that you guys came on today and shot the shit with me about all this kind of stuff. And we just kind of scratched the surface. And the sad part is, if you're not a filmmaker, I know that we're an art-centric podcast and we kind of touch in all mediums as we can. You can probably pull some stuff from this, because I'm always of the mind that art in itself is applicable in all mediums. It's just a matter of, the artist interpreting it in that particular way. But you're getting a little bit of an insight into why I personally, I'm not going to speak for Mr. Brainwater or anybody else who's ever come on this podcast, but I think film is the superior medium only because it involves literally every other medium of art. It's fashion, it's painting, it's writing, it's acting, it's photography, it's sound design, it's music. You name it, we do it. And to have, as Chris said, to have all these things work and make sense is a fucking miracle. It's like, if I was explaining it to a normal person, I would say, imagine putting together a wedding for 2 months straight. Like, that's basically the gist of it. And I don't think a lot of people, catering. Yeah, right down to it. Absolutely. Except I've yet to attend a wedding that's been catered by pizza or Chinese food, but that would actually be a kick-ass wedding in my opinion. But anyway, again, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you guys for coming on. I really appreciate your insight. Halloweeny do you guys have a set release date, or is it just when it's ready, it's ready?
I think it'll be probably I'm looking up at my calendar right now, the 22nd, October 22nd.
That's great. That's right in time for Halloween. And it'll be, will people be able to see it on YouTube, Vimeo?
Yeah, it'll be on YouTube, Vimeo. Yeah.
That's great. If you check out my Twitter handle, at the Anjow, I will more than likely be retweeting it. I follow both of these people. If you guys want to drop your Twitter handles, you're more than welcome to do that as well. They will be on screen on our YouTube thing, but go ahead and say them now for our audio listeners.
Sure. I'm at Foggy Moors, FOGGYMOORS.
And I'm Chris Creature.
That creature from the Black Lagoon pining has carried over into adulthood. Yes.
I love all sorts of creatures and monsters, and I've always felt a little bit of a creature. So myself. So also my last name has all the vowels, so this is much easier to spell. That's
fair. That's very fair. Coming with someone who has a terrible last name to pronounce, I understand and relate. So October 22nd, Halloweeny, and one more time, Law Signal SOC at Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And the website is
lawsignalsociety.com.
And I'm assuming if they search for those keywords on YouTube, they'll find your page there. So definitely subscribe to that page. Is there a Vimeo or is it just the YouTube?
I think it's just YouTube. Yeah.
Okay, good. You're not bougie. That's the Vimeo people. I'm not a fan of the Vimeo. I always have trouble getting it to load. Anyway, Halloweeny, October 22nd. Make sure you support IATSE with their strike vote, and if you can, please do your part to raise awareness on social media. You can connect with these fine folks on social media as well. And also check out some of these awesome horror movies. And I hopefully you guys will take some of the stuff that we've talked about today and put it in your art as usual. Even if you're not making a horror film, there's definitely things that you can glean from today's discussion that I think you can creatively, as we are artists, inject into your work. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for the rest of this month. October is spooky season. So right here on Midnight to the Spaghetti Factory, we will be talking all things spooky. We're going to be talking about carving pumpkins in an upcoming episode and how you can get artistic and creative with stencils and all that fun stuff. Rainwater will hopefully be back very soon, and he is not a horror movie person, and I am going to be doing an intro to horror class with him, where he's going to pick my brain about stuff. I'm going to recommend movies to him, and I can also be recommending them to you if you are not a big horror movie junkie like myself and these fine folks. So there's that, and there's a whole lot more coming up, so make sure you stay tuned all throughout this month, and we will see you guys next week. Take it easy.